Well, let's get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. My name's Peter Loewen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And I'm joined today by the Honourable Jean Charest. We're going to have a discussion about foreign policy, about leadership, about your experience. Before we start, the thing I do want to say is that, at the University of Toronto, we do live and operate here on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. I feel very lucky to be here at this university, which sits right on top of the old traditional Tattle Creek, and we continue to live and to work and have fun and to thrive here. Mr. Charest, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming. You're in the middle of a political race, so we're going to talk about politics a little bit, but from the perspective of foreign policy, if that works for you.
Yes.
First thing I'm going to start off with is just to, and we'll have a Q&A from the audience in a little bit, so if you've got questions, please write them out on a card. We've got a big online audience who will supply questions as well. But I want to start out by asking you a tough question about Ukraine.
Yes.
What is the Canadian government doing well right now in our response to Ukraine? What would we be doing differently if you were Prime Minister?
Well, Peter, let me start by saying that on foreign policy in general, Canadian political parties should make a very real effort to work together and to share common perspectives and a common approach. I'm a traditionalist in that sense of the word. I think that when we leave our shores, that we should try to speak with one voice. And so this isn't a partisan issue, and it's true for all things that fall under the theme of international relations. Now, I'm not saying that we're not going to be in a situation where we will criticize. That will happen, and there will be real disagreements. What I'm saying is that we should make a very real effort to try to speak with one voice. It falls on the government, by the way, to be reaching out to the opposition parties and to bringing them in. And I'm hoping that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is doing that with her opposition critics, to brief them, to tell them what's happening, and to explain to them what their perspective is and take in the legitimate concerns they have. I think we're doing as much, we seem to be doing as much as we can, but what Ukraine has revealed also is some major gaps and weaknesses in our defense abilities. We should be doing everything we can to supply Ukraine at this point with offensive weapons, because it is a war and they are fighting back against the Russians. And it isn't just about defending the territory, but also pushing back so that they can regain the total sovereignty of their territory. On that front, I think we should actually look at procurement of weapons that we can buy for the Ukrainians if we don't have them ourselves, so that they can push back and have the tools they need to fight the Russians. We should be looking at how we can supply them with manufacturing capacity here. I'm thinking of our ability to build light armored vehicles, for example. We have a General Dynamics plant in London, Ontario that can do that, and can certainly switch on some production that would allow us to give some support. We've committed $500 million worth of aid, or military aid. We need to deploy that, and we know that the ability of the federal government of actually making a commitment but actually delivering on it is, one thing about the federal government is that there is a broader issue of its operational abilities right now. Think of Pearson, think of COVID, there is a much broader debate, and it applies also to defense. Aid should be a big part of it, and eliminating all the red tape that we can, so that Ukrainians who want to come here for refuge and for security can. I think we have to be very flexible in that sense also, because some people will come here for a short period, a longer period. Some may choose to stay. And we should be very flexible in accommodating them and supporting them in that period, and supporting the countries who are taking in refugees and taking a very important burden on their shoulders. We should be reviewing sanctions. We know that there are gaps in our ability on sanctions here in Canada. Our banking laws are not as transparent as other countries are in regards to who's investing, oligarchs in this country and others. We need to review that to be much more rigorous in applying sanctions. And as we look to the future, Ukraine will have to rebuild at one point. And Canada should, in terms of our leadership, we should be preparing or volunteering to be a leader in the rebuilding of Ukraine. It'll take the world. They are fighting a battle on our behalf, is my view. It isn't just about Ukraine, it is about Canada. It is about our sovereignty. It is about liberal democracies. And so this is a war that touches us very directly. And the Ukrainians, given their extraordinary courage, deserve the support of the world as they will eventually have to rebuild their country.
Does Canada have the capacity, you touched briefly but importantly on serious questions about the operational capacity of the federal government?
Yeah.
So there's really two questions there. One is, why do you think that there is a depletion of our operational capacity, our ability to just get things done? And the follow-on question is, if you were Prime Minister, given those kind of constraints we have operationally, does Canada have the capacity to be the kind of leader we think we should be in the world? I mean, it's even the notion of supplying light armor vehicles is a good one, but not one that can happen overnight given the world we're in.
Well, you're asking a very big question, and it speaks to our federal system of government. And I don't think, in my experience, I don't think there's always been a clear understanding of how our country actually works and how you make it operate. For example, at the very basis, this country is run on a day-to-day basis by the provinces. Healthcare, education, look at the budgets. If you look at the operating budgets of provinces and compare it to the federal government, it tells a story. Yeah. And the provinces are sovereign in their areas of jurisdiction. Now, the word sovereign may sound very consequential, but it is in that technical sense. They are the ones who decide. Then comes the role of the federal government. If the federal government understands that, then they know that they need to get the provinces involved or decision makers at the early stages so that they can then make commitments at the international level and actually deliver on them. And I'll give you one example. I went through Haiti. When I was Premier of Quebec, we did an official visit in Haiti in 2005. My wife Michelle was with me. At that time, the federal government was funding, they were helping out with MINUSTA, with the United Nations intervention, but also we had a special operation of sending police officers from Canada to Haiti. Most of them, of course, from Quebec because they were French-speaking, from Laval, Sherbrooke, Montreal, from Quebec City. Well, they could not do that without my government being totally involved and authorizing that and making it happen. So that's the condition by which we can actually be operational and make things happen on the international stage. And if the federal government understands that, well then, and they're respectful of jurisdictions and they reach out, well then we'll be efficient. If not, we won't.
Yes. Ukraine. Should Ukraine be a member of NATO?
At this point, I'd say that isn't the right path. The immediate concern is to fight back against Russia. And on that front, we have to work with our allies in NATO, but I don't think that's the question we should be pursuing in the short term. We should be fighting this war and assisting Ukraine in fighting back against the Russians. And who knows whether down the road that will happen or not. You see the recent episode of Finland and Sweden coming in and the objections of Turkey. A very interesting story is revealing a bit about NATO. NATO has been fortified, ironically, through this whole process. It has become more relevant. It's given NATO a cause. But should Ukraine be in NATO at this point? I wouldn't be pursuing that. In the short term, I'd set that aside.
Yeah, I just want one more question for you on NATO and on Europe actually, and the conflict in Ukraine. You have views in this, and good for you to share them with us. What's the role of Canadian energy, which has been a real important part of our trade discussion, but we haven't thought about it as a foreign policy issue for some time. What's the role of Canadian energy in trying to rebalance Europe vis-a-vis Russia?
Two issues I think have been brought to the fore with the war. One is security of supply, which no one thinks about, in fairness, unless there's a crisis. But that's the job of governments, by the way. I mean, day-to-day citizens are not going to be preoccupied by that, but governments, our job in government is to think about these things, anticipate, and make sure that we do have security of supply. Give you an example, in Quebec there used to be 8 refineries, there's now 2. 2 only. If those refineries closed, that would create a great deal of vulnerability in that economy, and yet no one raises this. I mean, no one talks about that. And justifiably so, because it's not a crisis today. The second issue, of course, is our ability to be a reliable, ethical supplier for the rest of the world, which we're not. We're now restricted to the United States. We're enclaved, so to speak. We've been selling our product at a discount and losing literally billions of dollars. How many Canadians know that we have been losing billions of dollars of revenue because we have a single client who obviously takes advantage of that situation to buy our products at a discount? And we have not been able to build pipelines, and we haven't been able to organize that debate in such a way where I think we could have made better decisions. Energy East is a good example,
Yes.
Very good example. And I think there was a lack of leadership or experience. Energy East I was involved in. When I was premier, this project was on the table. It was early going, and we were in favor of it. There was another parallel project with Enbridge that
Yes.
ended up getting done,
Yes.
so it can be done. And then when I was in the private sector, I did some work for TransCanada. What I had suggested at the time, Peter, from my experience, is that the Quebec Pension Fund, la Caisse de dépôt, buy part of the project. Had they done that early on, it would have created in Quebec a very different debate in regards to what the value of the project was and what it meant. But none of that was really contemplated, and instead we ended up with a debate that went nowhere because people just talking over each other.
Yes.
And now we don't have the ability to export. So now we need to look at how we can do it. Same is true for natural gas. There's probably more potential in the short term for LNG export projects. There's one project on the West Coast that is now being built, but there are a few of them on the East Coast that have potential, and that could allow us to be a supplier.
What would you do as Prime Minister to push through projects like Energy East? I mean, ultimately, the economics were arguably there. It came up against pretty serious opposition from the City of Montreal. How do you, respecting provincial jurisdiction, how do you think? And you've been on both sides of this.
Yeah.
As a Prime Minister, how do you actually pull together provinces in a way that's going to allow you to do big national projects that have foreign policy implications?
I'm going to start by saying something that's obvious, but probably needs to be restated. None of these projects are easy to do. None of them. You have to accept from the outset, you have these huge projects, that they're going to be difficult to get done. And there is going to be opposition. And that opposition is legitimate. It's not as though it's not just opposition. The people have real concerns. But none of these projects get done unless there's leadership, unless someone says it has to get done. And Mr. Trudeau never did that on Energy East or other projects, unless the Prime Minister says, this is something that we need to get done, and we're going to do it right. We're going to do the environmental assessment. We're going to get social acceptability. Then it gets. But if there's no leadership, these projects are just about impossible to get done. So that's the first difference. I did a pipeline in Quebec, the last one built there, from Lévis all the way down to the South Shore of Montreal. And when we announced that we were going to do it. It wasn't a question of whether or not we were going to do it. Yes. The question was, how do we get it right? And we were very committed to getting it right and doing it the right way. And there's a lot of good reasons to do pipelines, by the way, including security. I mean, I come from the eastern townships in Quebec. Lac-Mégantic is only a few kilometers away where my mother was born in the village of Bury. I know that area very well. And Michelle, my wife, was down there for the Red Cross. I mean, there are security reasons too. So there are good reasons for us to do these projects and get them right. But in Quebec, why did it go south? There was absolutely no one, Peter, on the other side saying, this is why it should be done.
Yes.
Here are good reasons. There was total void. So of course, the debate went in one direction only.
Yeah, I mean, one gets a sense that we've really politicized energy development in the country in a way that views it as a regional issue rather than as one of national security or national imperative.
We've lost sight. And by the way, the question is, by the way, in the broader scheme of things, how do we transition to reach zero emissions in 2050? Europe came out with its policy in late January, beginning of February, after Glasgow, before the war in Ukraine, in which they said two things. We are going to have to develop nuclear and natural gas to get to zero emissions by 2050. Isn't it interesting that Europe, that is viewed as being on the forefront of this issue of climate, they are actually acknowledging that we'll have to do both. Well, there's something in there for Canada to learn from in terms of our ability to develop our resources and reach zero emissions by 2050 and how we get there. And by the way, a lot of it is in the design of the programs, and if you get it wrong, you're going to lose the public along the way. So this isn't a trivial matter. It'll require a lot of experience and determination. Can it get done? The answer is yes. It pains me in this leadership race to see Conservatives unable to claim their legacy on the environment. Yes. The government of Mulroney did the Montreal Protocol on CFCs and HCFCs, the most successful environmental treaty in the world, yes, with market mechanisms, yes, in it, as we did the Clean Air Act in 1990 with the Bush administration. And again, a very successful, yes, treaty with market mechanisms in them. And I always point to that because I also think we need to be optimistic on our ability to get these, yes, things done. We can get them done. Yes. They're not easy. None of this is easy to get done, but we can get things done.
I want to follow up on this directly. So you've been in politics in various forms for a long time. Yeah. I think it's fair to say. You started out as a very young politician and cabinet minister, Mr. Mulroney. You're Minister of the Environment, and then of course made a very successful transition to provincial politics. When you look back at the foreign policy of Mr. Mulroney, the foreign policy of Mr. Harper, is there a conservative foreign policy? Do we have even go back to Mr. Diefenbaker? Is there a conservative approach to foreign policy, or has it really been different under each prime minister? And what would you take from each of those periods of time as lessons about what a Jean Charest foreign policy would be?
And one of the things, Peter, that I think the country would wish for, not just in foreign policies but in other areas, is continuity. You know, in my experience, what gives a country strength in the long term is an element of continuity in politics. If every new administration comes in is tearing down what the previous one has tried to do, then, I mean, you're just starting over and over again, and it becomes very, I think, very difficult to have a long-term effective ability to govern in all areas. A foreign policy, you mentioned Diefenbaker. How many people remember that Diefenbaker was one of the leaders in the world in the Commonwealth that fought against apartheid in South Africa? And Mr. Mulroney took up that battle, and he went up against Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and didn't do it in a hostile way, but still, it was very clear that they had a disagreement on this, and he pushed back. Mr. Chrétien followed up on apartheid. That's what gave Canada that strength and credibility on issues like this. And on foreign policy, Stephen Harper also had a very principled approach. Some will remember his interaction with Putin. I think it may have been, I'm trying to think, it's not a G7 meeting, but at one of the meetings in which he, maybe in a G20 meeting, where he confronted Mr. Putin on Ukraine and said, you should get out of Ukraine. This was after the Crimea episode. It may have been after their entering into Donbass. And so there is an element of continuity. Our foreign policy, though, has suffered from certain things. And I was a special envoy for Mr. Trudeau on the campaign to get a seat on the Security Council. Yes. And what I saw was interesting. Our branding in the world remains very powerful. That hasn't changed. I mean, we should be proud of that, and for good reason. But we are missing in action in a lot of parts of the world, in Africa in particular, you know, where our potential for being a constructive presence in Africa is quite extraordinary. Francophone Africa in particular, and all parts of Africa, Northern Africa, places like Tunisia, places where there has been some very profound changes. And then we've been missing in action in the Middle East. There's a lot of potential of what's happening now with the Abrahamic Accords between the Emirates and Israel, in Asia in a lot of places, or we have not been constant in our presence. So Canada has some major failures. As we look ahead, if you allow me, and the things I've seen that are interesting that have changed in our branding, in the business community, the thing that has really evolved that's positive is the presence of our pension funds throughout the world. CPPIB, Caisse de dépôt, OMERS, teachers. Few people have picked up on this, but I worked for the law firm of McCarthy Tétrault when we met with law firms in Europe, either Paris or Singapore or elsewhere. It was fascinating. It would take 5 minutes in any meeting. The first subject that would come up from other foreign law firms was what our pension funds are doing in their country. And the 10 biggest pension funds in Canada are the biggest investors in infrastructure in the world.
Yes.
And one of the new trends that the UN is pushing in terms of development in the world is blended finance. That this is a method by which there is public and private funding for. So there's a whole new avenue that's opening up in which Canada is very well positioned to play a role in the world.
Yeah. So what's your sense then of kind of where the challenge actually is for Canada, right? Is it that we've just not focused on enough areas? Can we focus on all of them at once? Is it that we're not actually putting enough money into foreign aid? Is it that we're not putting enough money into military procurement? The question in some sense is what are the things that you can do what are the things that you can fix in the short term if you become Prime Minister to improve our standing?
Most of us who have followed all of this all agree that we need a major rethink of our foreign and defense policy. What I've committed to in this leadership race is that we do a whole rethink of both together, foreign and defense, because they obviously go together. And we need to take into account how the world has changed very radically over the last 20 years. I mean, it starts, of course, with the fall of communism and this naive view that we had, sentiment that we would live forever in liberal democracies with market-based economies. All of this has been turned on its head, of course, and we're learning that history is not a straight line. It's messy, with periods in which we make progress but also fall back terribly, and that's what we're witnessing now. But it requires a very strong persistence and determination in pursuing our values and what we believe in, and identifying what our core interest is, Peter. I think we need to redefine our core interest. Among the things that have changed, our American neighbor is not the American ally we had 20 years ago. They are not, we could always rely on a default situation where they would have our back. That's not true today. And we know that they're more inward looking than they ever have been. The change between the Biden and Trump administration looks more like a smile than actually policy change as we watch things unfold. For example, in the North, I'll use a real-time example. Yes. I'm a big believer that we should affirm our sovereignty in the North. It speaks to Ukraine. We have Russia as a physical neighbor. Climate change has opened up new trade routes. The Northern Passage on the Russian side, which is the one that is the easiest to navigate. The Russians said they would not militarize that passage. They have.
Yes.
And now there's the Northwest Passage. But how many people know that the Northwest Passage is not recognized either by our American ally or European allies as being Canadian territory? In fact, Pompeo delivered a speech in Finland in 2019 that I found fascinating because he went out of his way. This was at the Arctic Council. This is Mike Pompeo. Out of no particular reason, goes out of his way in the speech. You can almost see him curve into it to say that the Northwest Passage is not Canadian territory. I mean, when your allies are doing that to you, well, then you have to question, where do I stand in the world? And so there's that. And then the extraordinary fact that we live in a world where we've seen the evolution and the appearance of these developed countries and a superpower, China. Yes. I mean, in our lifetime, we have seen China rise up as a superpower. And we know something in Canada about superpowers. We live next to one. And superpowers behave a certain way, by the way.
Yes.
They have impulses. And when they have an obstacle in front of them, they tend to, swipe it aside. Every Canadian Prime Minister knows that. And every Canadian Prime Minister knows that one of his biggest challenges is to manage that relationship, not just with a neighbor, but a neighbor who is a superpower and behaves like a superpower. So we have to redefine what our relationship will be with the United States, how we manage that relationship. I would draw on the lessons of NAFTA and CUSMA, where the full court press is what works most effectively with our American neighbors. Everyone is on deck, provinces, cities, business people, if we want to be effective and have an effective influence on our American neighbor. I think we have to be more firm with them on issues like trade in the automotive industry. They need to have access to strategic minerals that we have, and yet they're barring us from having access to the development of a whole new automotive industry. Well, we need to be, I think, much more firm in our negotiations with them on that. We have common interest on the environment. on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for example, on issues like that. And then in the rest of the world, well, we have to figure out where our real allies are. My own sentiment has always been that we're now moving into blocks. And if you look at the world in that way, Europe is about 25% of the world's GDP. North America is another 25%. And then you have Asia as another 25%. And then the rest of the world, the other 25%. My inclination, Peter, to answer more directly the question, is that Canada should be in the forefront of building a bloc that would include Europe and North America, and that would allow us to further develop trade, further develop our own alliances, labor mobility. I'm a big, big believer in the fact that whoever gets labor mobility right in this world, and Canada's at the top of the list, will really stand out as a country that will progress.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one to figure out, but we should work on that. And that block is something that we need to develop further. But it's a challenge because the Americans aren't there. The Europeans, I think, would be. But we would be in a good position to move the dial in developing that block.
Yes. Let me tell you something which I heard a couple of years ago, which has really impacted my thinking, and it was by Jesus Seara, who was the chief negotiator for the Mexicans on USMCA,
Yeah.
or TMEC as he calls it.
Yeah.
And he says, when a fisherman in Portugal and a guy working for a tech company in Finland think about a foreign policy issue about Europe, they don't have shared values in some sense. They're not the same. They don't view themselves as being part of the same country. They live very different lives, but they understand that some issues are European issues.
Yeah.
And that some issues matter to everyone, irrespective of where you live in Europe. We don't have the same mindset about North America in Canada. We don't think about how a policy impacts us, the US, and Mexico at the same time, despite NAFTA being in place and in operation for now 30 years, right? And despite all the effort that we put into USMCA. And even in the way you're talking, in some sense, I mean, we're always in this delicate balance of figuring out how to be effective neighbors of the U.S., but to strike out on our own, right? Is there a North American vision that you can articulate for us?
There is one. I mean, there was the attempt by the Clinton administration to lead on the creation of this zone of the Americas in the early 90s that failed. And the reason why it failed, I think, Peter, is that as long as it's about us, but not about us, them and us, then we're not going to get very far. I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking of. If we're going to make any progress in developing a bloc, let's say in the Americas, it has to be how we help those countries develop, not just about trade. What is it that we need to do with them that will allow them to develop their infrastructure, to develop their education system, to allow more of the students to come in, to be able to train them, educate? If we put it on that level, well then I think we have a conversation and we have a common interest. Maybe we need to move the conversation more toward common interests as opposed to trying to debate values, which sometimes may or may not resonate with people, but if it's common interest. So if I hesitate on working, the word Marshall Plan is overused a lot, and we forget that Marshall Plan was about rebuilding the defeated after war. The concept of a Marshall Plan starts with helping the defeated rebuild themselves. That's what was enlightening about it. But the equivalent of a Marshall Plan for the Americas that says, how can we help you build your infrastructure and your capacity? If you start at that level, well then I think you're going to have a very constructive conversation that will allow better integration and the better taking into account or accounting for common interest among all members of the Americas.
And vis-a-vis China, what should we be doing?
China.
Let's switch it up, but let's hear about your vision of. I mean, in some ways, I'd love to hear about how you articulate the challenge of being alongside China. I think Canadians, we're not. It took us a long time to realize that, Vancouver is as many flying hours from Beijing as Canberra is, or Sydney are, right? And the Australians figured that out earlier on. We're kind of still late to the game on realizing that we are a Pacific nation. But what are the challenges with China, and how does Canada effectively live with those challenges?
China is now a superpower, and this has happened in our lifetime. It's fascinating when you think of it. because how many generations in mankind will have seen that emerge, in your lifetime? And that conditions a great deal of what we need to know about how we define a relationship with China. Now, China's about, 15 or 16% of the world's GDP, and that's going to continue to grow with a very strong population base and ambitions. China has a nationalist government, authoritarian government, and so they have ambitions, and they're building themselves up at a very rapid pace. We have to take that into account as we define what a relationship needs to be with China. It's when you look around the world, it's interesting because take Australia. Australia it has a trade agreement with China. They are the most important trading partner, and yet they're conflicted in a number of ways with them right now, and are very real. And China has pushed back hard on Australia, punishing them for the position they took on COVID-19, for example, and the investigation. And yet, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, almost a year ago, people forget it now, signed into a major trade agreement with China called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. 16 countries. The only country that signed out of it was India. This is one of the most significant trade agreements done in the last 10 years, not because it's as detailed as CETA between Canada and Europe or CUSMA, but because it does commit these countries with China to work on harmonizing their rules. What I'm saying is our interests go both ways. We want to, in our relationship with China, maintain the values that are Canadians, and we want to defend them, and we want to make sure that when our relationship with China, that we speak to those issues, that we don't allow China to get away with doing things that are contrary to human rights and to the values we believe in. At the same time, we have to work with China on issues like climate change, for example. We cannot deal with reaching zero emissions by 2050 without the commitment of China and without them being part of the solution. It just can't happen. Our security in the world depends on our ability to work with China also. And the key issue, sensitive issue, for example, of Taiwan, which has become their big red line right now. And so we have a lot of work to do to define how we deal with China, what our core interest is. We just can't cut them off and act as though they don't exist. That's just not feasible. But we need an approach, and we need to do it with our allies. We saw that in an episode of the two Michaels when they were kidnapped by the Chinese government. I think what was very effective in dealing with that, Peter, and what I witnessed was the pressure put on by the international community on the Chinese. And the Canadian government was effective in rallying a lot of that support around the world to make them intervene. I'm thinking of the Germans, for example. I'll give you one example that strikes. The German representative at the United Nations, as he was leaving his position, I forget his name, made a comment about the two Michaels being kidnapped. I mean, that was the direct intervention of the Canadian government encouraging them to speak to it. And the Chinese may have pushed back on it, but I guarantee you that would have an effect on them. And that was helpful in helping to free the two Michaels. Yes. So those are the kind of things. We have to work in a coalition of countries who will also take a similar approach with China.
How do we articulate, how does a prime minister deal with domestic demands to articulate concerns about things like Hong Kong and the security law, about Taiwan, about the genocide in Xinjiang? How does a prime minister approach that? That domestic demand for us to raise issues of human rights in China with the sensitivity of that government towards criticism?
Well, there's no easy answer to that. We just have to raise it, and yes, they'll push back. But we also know that by raising it, it does create, and it does. We should not come to the conclusion that it doesn't have an effect. It does have an impact on the way the Chinese government will deal with the issues of either Hong Kong or with the Uyghur or other issues in the country. And we just have to do it. We have to be, I think, smart about it in the way that we need to coalition build around that, not be the only ones. We can't be viewed as just, wagging our finger. We need to, I think, make it part of a broader foreign policy where a whole like-minded countries are also doing the same thing. That, in the end, is what will have the most effect on China.
Yeah. And how does the Prime Minister deal with the broader set of demands that come from having a very diverse country with interests all around the world?
Yeah.
So take on the issue of Ukraine, Canada has the third largest Ukrainian population in the world.
Yep.
After Ukraine and Russia, and that surely is part of what drives the demand among Canadians for an effective response in Ukraine. We've got very large populations who have ties all over the world, and as a Prime Minister, you inevitably face demands to speak out on issues which are difficult issues in other countries, right?
Yep.
Which have difficult domestic constituencies. How do we deal with diasporic politics in our foreign policy?
That's a very good question. What we called in French le communautarisme, being a foreign policy defined by the diaspora, which isn't where we should be. I mean, but yet you're quite right. It's not as though any government can be oblivious to the fact that we have a very important Ukrainian diaspora in Canada that we work with, who are very active right now for obvious reasons, and a very good diaspora, by the way. I mean, this is in a long-term involvement in Ukrainian Canadians, very active in politics also. And so, yes, we should work with the diaspora. Where I think the red line is that we should be very careful on not allowing us to import within the country conflicts that are happening in another country. They should not be playing out in Canada. And we should not, I'm among those who's very concerned about foreign intervention in our politics, whether it be from Russia or China or anywhere else. That is unacceptable. And when you come to Canada, you come here as a Canadian, we encourage Canadians to maintain their interest and their link to their countries of origin. That's a positive thing. That's a very good, it's part of their identity, and that is fine. But we should draw the line in actually playing out here in Canada the conflicts that are happening elsewhere. That's not for us to, and we shouldn't accept that people come here to actually play that out on our domestic territory.
I'm going to go to the cards.
Yes.
We have questions from the audience. So here's one. Should we reconsider over-reliance on globalization, given how borders, especially Chinese, close for our crucially needed medical and manufacturing supplies?
Well, it's a very big issue right now, especially with supply chains having collapsed. And I'll answer the simplest way I can. Globalization is here to stay. It's not going to go away. Now, what will be globalization will be different from what we had. And it will continue to evolve. And we're going to see more protectionism. On supply chains, we're going to see more reshoring. Janet Yellen used a very interesting concept in a speech she delivered recently, talking of friendshoring. Friendshoring. I hadn't heard the concept before, and that refers to having companies who are operating in supply chains of friendly countries, reliable countries. And so it speaks to the broader block of countries I was thinking of earlier, of Europe and Canada and the Americas. And so globalization is going to be different from what it was, and probably for the better. For example, if you're a Canadian company who has a supply chain operations in China, you should have a China +1 policy, meaning that you should have an alternative in another country. And we're moving in that direction. Canada has now just opened trade negotiations with ASEAN, the 10 countries of ASEAN, 600 million people. It includes Vietnam and Cambodia and Singapore, very, very diverse. And we're actually, within ASEAN, we're in trade negotiations with Indonesia right now, 4th most populous country in the world, 240 million people. Biggest Muslim country in the world, by the way. So those are the smart things we should be doing in regards to globalization. I would add globalization, and we tried to do it in the Canada-Europe trade agreement. I was very involved in that. In the trade agreements we do, it should include issues like the environment and, yes, labor rights. And we have to be careful not to intrude in the sovereignty of a country, but I would include labor mobility, culture, education. We should use the trade agreements to broaden them to a broader, more structured relationship with the countries with whom we're talking to. And that allows Canada to exercise its soft power. What makes us attractive to the rest of the world? We know it, and here on a campus at the University of Toronto, the Munk School is attracting students from all over the world to come here to train. So those are the things that I see in the future of globalization.
We're going to put you through your international relations comprehensive exam now. What's the greatest challenge to the rules-based international order, and what role can Canada play to make sure it survives?
I think when the Trump administration came in, Donald Trump did his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia, and on the return, I remember the date. I think it was a piece written in the Wall Street Journal by McMaster, who was his national security advisor and his economic advisor at the time. And if you haven't read that, it is, in French we'd say pièce d'anthologie, 2nd of June 2017 in the Wall Street Journal, where essentially they say this: the world is not multilateral. I'm paraphrasing. The world is, and the word they use I thought was very revealing, the world is an arena. An arena. You're the Americans. An arena in which you exercise your full strength. And the American administration at the time says, this is for us an arena. It's not a multilateral world. And we use our influence in culture and economics. And a few days later, there was a speech by Chrystia Freeland as Minister of Foreign Affairs in the House of Commons, who takes up Canada's position in contrast to that, saying we believe in multilateralism. And Canada needs to work with all the other countries for whom that's the only option. There's only a few countries in the world for whom unilateralism really works, isn't there? I mean, China or the United States, or maybe Russia thinks it works. I don't think it's working very well for them now. But multilateralism has to be the only salient answer for Canada. And I think we should work with our most immediate allies to make that case, and that includes Europe and other countries around the world who believe in the same thing.
It seemed to me that there are always two things that Mr. Trump was saying and were doing at the same time, right? And one of them was about not respecting or wanting to maintain that international rules-based order, but just wanting to have more pure politics for the U.S., pure power politics. But the second thing, which we ignored, because we didn't want to listen to the first thing, was he spoke a lot about burden sharing, right? And he was not wrong on that. He was actually right, that it was the obligation of Germany and Canada, other countries in NATO, to pay our share and to do our 2%, right? You've committed Canada to 2% of GDP of broader engagement in the spirit of burden sharing across the rules-based order. Can we actually get there as a country? Can we get to a place where we're spending 2%?
We can, and there is a burden sharing issue. And it isn't just the burden sharing, it's not just the material and the financial part, it's also taking up a lead position on security. This is especially true in Asia. We know the Americans cannot be effective, for example, in Asia, and Mr. Biden just did a trip recently on that, without working very closely with allies in the Philippines and Japan and South Korea, and otherwise you just can't get there. And by the way, on that trip, I thought it was revealing that Canada was not invited to the grouping of the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that Mr. Biden was proposing, which included dealing with 4 issues: data, supply chains, I think in environment and energy transition. I mean, there was 4 issues, and Canada's not even invited to it. Now, back to your question on 2%, yes. We'll have to get there gradually, because we can't, you just don't go out there and do procurement on either submarines or ships or planes, as we know now, especially the fact that Canada has a pretty bad history on military procurement. It's been bad on it. By the way, every government, without exception, has not done it well, frankly, ever since I've been in politics. So we need to review procurement, but we'll get there gradually. We need to increase the number of troops we have. I would move that up to 75,000 regulars and 50,000 reservists. But we're experiencing labor shortages. So, can we get there easily? No. It'll require incentives. It'll require a real effort to get there. But we need to do a much bigger effort in our own interest to affirm our sovereignty. And again, I would build 2 militaries in the Arctic, one with a deep water port. I would have icebreakers that are armed. We need to build submarines. Those are the things that will move us to 2%, but for the right reasons. The North, I feel very, very strongly about, and we need to move urgently in that respect.
Yeah, you've articulated it just now, and it's in your policy as well, what you want to do in terms of infrastructure and resources in the North. How do we deal with the sovereignty issue? How do we get to a place where Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage is recognized?
I don't know whether we'll ever get the Americans to recognize that. When you ask them about it and you ask their folks in the State Department, they'll tell you that the issue isn't Canada, it's other places in the world where, whether it's Taiwanese Strait or elsewhere, that if we were to recognize Canada's sovereignty, that would compromise our position in other places around the planet where, I don't know whether they're referring to the Strait of Hormuz or, and so I don't know whether we'll ever get there, but certainly the Europeans would be in a better position to recognize our sovereignty. And the other part of sovereignty is simple, it's occupation. If we're not occupying that territory, if we're not present, then we're ceding ground. We need to be, the furthest post we have, as we know, is alert, which is way up at the extreme of our territory, but alert is a station of communications, it's not a military post. And so I think building 2 military bases is a great investment. There's a lot of money, and we shouldn't underestimate. And it has to be done with a culturally sensitive approach to the region. You just don't come in and build. I mean, we're dealing with the Inuit and the Cree up in the north in particular. And so, but occupying, physically being there is 90% of that sovereignty effort.
Yes, yes. Well, this is. I mean, if you can claim it,
yes,
hope people recognize it, right?
Yeah.
We can't do the first thing right now. There's an interesting question here, which is one you'll have views on, about how Canada can position itself as a bigger mover in the francophone spaces in the world, and we made a decision in foreign policy in 2006 to cut back on the number of countries we were going to focus on and invest in foreign aid to about 3-4 dozen. With more effect, we can debate whether that was good or not, right? But Canada arguably has also played less of a role in the francophonie around the world in the last 20 years. Your thoughts on this?
And we have, and the francophonie speaks by the way, to the great potential over foreign influence, because not a lot of countries in the world have that ability to have a strong presence in francophone countries as we do, especially in West Africa. And I'll share a personal anecdote. The first file I did when I joined McCarthy's was to negotiate a new mining agreement for a Canadian mining company in Senegal. Well, of course. Why? Well, because I speak French, and they're part of the francophonie. And it was a great experience for me, very much a learning experience. And yet, again, not a lot of people know this. Canada has a very strong presence in the mining sector in Western Africa. These are Canadian companies. I was at the airport in Senegal, and some guy yelling at me, "Hey, Charest!" The guy from L'Abitibi. I went to French Guiana also for a client. We go into the forest and they're digging, and this guy comes down on a 4x4 to bring us up to the place where they wanted us to visit. He takes it, he looks at me, he said, "Charest, tu fais ici?" And we have companies and people all over the world. In that part of the world, it's the French who's defending our interest, not us. And when in fact, after as we know, the terrible situation in Libya, this created an environment in which Al-Qaeda spread down to all of sub-Saharan Africa, including in Mali, with very real and dangerous consequences. And Canada isn't present in that part of the world. So we need a stronger security presence. And these countries are looking. And then I want to revert back to what I was saying earlier. These countries need to develop capacity. And we should be, let's acknowledge something. What we've seen from the 80s all the way up to 2008 was an extraordinary period of economic growth in the world. The locomotive of that growth was trade, because the growth in trade was around 7 or 8% a year worldwide. When GDP growth in the world was about 4%, that was the locomotive of growth. It pulled millions of people out of poverty, millions of people, and Canada was in the middle of all of that. Now, as we look ahead, let's look at how we can help countries build capacity. It includes our pension funds, it includes blended financing, and so we can do aid that will actually have economic consequences for Canada, positive consequences for Canada, but we should focus it on developing more capacity for these countries.
Yeah. Let me let you take the last couple of minutes to tell us, in a final wrap-up, what a Jean Charest foreign policy looks like. And I've heard about continuity, kind of positive engagement, seriousness on the domestic front to be able to follow through on our commitments.
Yes.
What else should we know?
Well, I think you would see us play a stronger voice in the world in areas where we can make a difference, and I'll use a few examples. Haiti is within our hemisphere, And Haiti is the story in Haiti is very, very sad because of the inability of the country to finally get its act together, get organized, and they terribly need help. There's a place in the world where Canada could play a leadership role. And by the way, I'm not saying it'd be easy, but far from it. We've been to Haiti, and I've been there a few times. There's a place. Ukraine is another example. We should now start to work discreetly, but in a real way, in trying to think through how the country needs to be rebuilt. There's an area where we should be speaking up. On energy, we should be much more conscious of our ability to supply the world with energy and to get it right, and to be a player in that respect, and to be there. So Asia, we need a much stronger presence in Asia. The ASEAN negotiations are important, but on the security level, we need to step up and to be part, in as much as we can, to be part of the security apparatus in that region of the world that needs a strong coalition to be able to push back against the presence of China. So those are the things, and I would be very inclined again to do whatever Canada can do to make the case that we need to build a strong bloc between Europe and the Americas. I was initiated the Canada-Europe trade agreements in 2007, and my dream at the time, ambition, was that would morph into NAFTA and Europe being on the same page. Now, the Americans started negotiations with Europe at the time. It was called TTIP, was the acronym. And that went south very rapidly because of concerns in Europe and in the United States. But those are all very short-sighted views. We need a better and a stronger, broader horizon of what the world can be. And Canada should be the country proposing these things. We're right in the middle of that. We should be the country saying, here is what we could do if we wanted to do it.
I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us.
Wow.
You're one of the giants of Canadian politics, but your command and the breadth and your grasp of the issues is really something to behold. So thank you very, very much for spending this hour with us.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
That's great.